My name is Janisset Rivero. I was born in Cuba, in the darkness of a totalitarian and communist regime that until today oppresses Cuban people. Can you imagine living in a place where you're not free to say your opinion? My father told me we were not free. I was 10 years old. He told me that was a secret that we couldn't share outside our home. That same year, thousands of Cubans tried to leave Cuba on rafts. They were attacked in repudiation acts. Eyewitnesses, some of those attacks. Our neighbors, medical doctor, her husband and two children were kept for 1 week in an apartment without electricity, without water, because she said in the hospital she used to work that she wanted to leave the country, that she didn't want to live in Cuba. And my father, secretly, with other neighbors, was helping them to have food and water. My father told me it was his duty to take us to a place where my sister and I could be free. During that time, my father showed me a shortwave radio he has hidden in his bedroom. And from that day on, we were listening to broadcasting coming from Europe or the US, Free Europe Radio, the voice of the Americas. And I had the opportunity to listen to all the struggles that people were having in other countries, fighting against oppression, against communism in Eastern Europe. One day, my father told me, we have to leave the country. We were going to Venezuela, and that was a secret too. How would you feel if all of a sudden you have to leave your family, your friends, your grandparents, and the life you've always knew? I didn't want to leave my country. I didn't want to leave my grandparents, my cousins, my family, my friends. But my father told me that once we were free, if I decided to come back to Cuba, he will allow me to do so. We left Cuba to Venezuela on a November day. And when we arrived in Venezuela, Venezuela was a democratic and free country. At that moment was the first time I met freedom. Have any of you been in a big city like New York, or for the first time, or maybe the first time in Disney World? If you have, do you remember how it felt to see all those big buildings and lights and sounds? That's what happened to me when I got to Caracas, Venezuela. Freedom hit me like a huge light. Caracas was a city full of lights, and I haven't seen so many lights in my life. I realized I was living in shadows. I was living in darkness, and I didn't know that. In Venezuela, I learned many truths that I did not know before. I learned that my uncle and godfather, Armando de Leon, was a political prisoner. When he was 16 years old, he was condemned to 30 years in prison. I met many former Cuban political prisoners during that time in Venezuela, and I began to learn Cuban history for the first time, the truth about our history. That I needed to look for the truth, and that I needed to help other people that were in Cuba under oppression to be free. At that moment, I was in high school, and I began to work with an association of students in communications in a newsletter in the high school I was. And I began to write on Venezuelan newspapers about my experience as a Cuban exile and about my experience with oppression and with freedom. On February 1989, we had to stay for 1 week in a state of emergency in our apartment in Caracas. The left had organized protests on the streets. They were destroying private property. The government declared a state of emergency. At that moment, my father told me, we need to live here. Communism is coming here, and I don't want you to be here, you and your sister, again, to experience the same as we did in Cuba. I didn't want to leave Venezuela. I had my friends. I have part of my family there, but we have to leave. And a year and a half after that, we arrived in the United States. My father knew what was going to happen in Venezuela. In 1992, it was Chavez's first attempt to power, and I was amazed. I told him, how did you know what was going to happen in Venezuela, and he told me, your mom and I, we experienced that in Cuba when we were very young and the revolution arriving to power. I arrived to the US, I continue studying, and I work for a long time on human rights. I promote human rights respect for Cuban people. I travel the world internationally, Europe, Latin America, the US, talking about the situation inside Cuba, trying to raise support for Cuban political prisoners and Cuban dissidents inside the island. And for that, I've been recognized by the city of Boston, also by the US Congress, for my work in favor of human rights. During my time living in the US, especially during the past years, I have clearly seen the penetration of socialist and communist ideas in our universities, in the media, in the public debate places of this country. I think that my fight for freedom continues here in the US. I feel compelled to continue through my testimony and through my personal experience, shedding light on the campaigns and maneuvers of the left, even here in the US. So that is why I joined the Libre Initiative in 2015. I'm now a GLA trainer to continue promoting freedom, to continue promoting the ideas of a free society, to continue promoting economic freedom for our country, because I know that socialist and communist ideas are not worth it. They bring only misery and disrespect of human rights for every country where they have been imposed. I feel the responsibility to continue promoting freedom. My daughter was born here in the US, my nephews too. My father is buried here in the US. Finally, I have a home, I have family and friends. I don't take freedom for granted. I want my daughter to be free, my nephews to be free, and to fulfill their dreams of prosperity and success.